Will there be a war in the 2020s decade? We'll first start by going over the history of war, defining war, where we are, where we think we are in that cycle today, and what the probabilities of war are. Justin already thinks that we are in a form of war. Justin, do you think you could expand on that a little further?
Yeah. So my take is, and this goes back to the beginning of, or at the end of 2019, when we had the medical issue crop up. I would argue that that is America is in a war right now with China. Now it's true we might not be shooting bullets, or at least technically yet, at each other, but to think that the American government and the Chinese government are not trying to bludgeon each other with various organs of state and using various ways to project power onto the other. I very much think that's going on. I would also add this too, is that I think there's some old quip where it's just that the military is always trained to fight the last war, and so when people talk about are we going into war, fourth turning always prescribes total war and so on and so forth. My answer is yes, that's probably right, but you have to look at it with a twist, because I think the war that's being fought right now is much more a war of the mind than a war of the real world as it stands. That's my take on it. Yes, we're at war, but the war is very much up here, not necessarily, at least for the time being, not necessarily spilling out into the real world yet.
Do you think you could explain to me what you mean when you say that it's in the mind? What do you mean by that?
Oh, well, so go back to what was it, 2019? When did we have those riots up in was it Minnesota?
March of 2020.
Is it more, whatever? So you go back 1 or 2 years, and if I was China and I wanted to destabilize the United States, well, what are my options? Well, okay, I can launch an attack, like warriors, ships, etc. And I'll probably lose at that front because number one, you appear as an active belligerent. In other words, people can see that you are attacking, and secondly, what it's going to do is going to provoke a response from the person you are attacking to kind of rally everyone together and link arms and forget their differences. So if I was against China wanting to take down America, what I would do or if I wanted to attack America, I wouldn't necessarily go in guns blazing. Rather, I would try to do whatever I could to infiltrate, let's say, the CNNs, the MSNBCs, the Fox Newses, whatever, the Alex Joneses of the world. And what I would try to do is I would try to poison the American mind, or I try to poison how the Americans viewed themselves. Because if you can get Americans, or if you can get your enemy, in this case, China would view us as an enemy. If you can get the enemy to basically destroy themselves from the inside out, to think that, oh my goodness, we're not good people, or we're nothing but a horrible, agglomeration of racists, nothing good has ever come out of America, blah, 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 whatever. Then all of a sudden, you don't actually have to really do anything. You're not seen as a belligerent. And if your enemy destroys himself from within, then great, all the more power to you. So that's kind of what I mean when I say you have a war of the mind. And I suspect that it's much easier for one state to attack another state in this way because, like Josh, if a warship pulled up into Boston Harbor and started shelling downtown Boston, that would probably raise a few red flags. That would be pretty obvious, right? Mm-hmm. But then again, if you had a bunch of bots on Twitter, Facebook, or a bunch of paid off anchors on mainstream media channels, it doesn't matter left or the right. The point is that just in what people assume to be otherwise trustworthy when they really weren't news sources, that would be an excellent way to sow lies, and these lies in turn could be the thing that would eventually allow the enemy to rip themselves apart, thus saving you, China, the trouble of having to attack in the first place.
I completely agree with everything that you just said, except one part where you think this is only now happening today, and this is where we're at that state of war. I think this is constantly happening, and most definitely happened in the past with different forms of media. You had the radio, the newspapers, and we know with historical data that this has actually happened in Germany in the 1940s with the certain group. They gave everybody a little walkie-talkie or whatever the hell those little radio things are called, and then they would spread propaganda every single day. Or just like what we're seeing today with shows and movies, if you go to a movie, you're just getting, or if you watch a sports event, you're just getting constant the social narrative pushed at you every single day, nonstop, at all times during the day. For the people who are thinking at it blindly, they're just going to accept it and say, well, yes, this just makes sense. And then it's going to be indoctrinated inside of them. But I would say for the person who disagrees with that narrative, it's just going to force hatred upon every single time they start to see that stuff. I agree with everything else, but that. And I do think, and I would also disagree with the fact I do think that we will see that kinetic type of warfare where we have people in the streets rioting, fighting in some form or another, just like for example, like what we saw with the riots in 2020, where people were in the streets destroying businesses, lighting fires, killing people over nothing. And when we have all of this energy and built up anger continuing to increase and rise, that is going to cause more and more harm and divide between people, which will, I think, eventually lead to a certain enemy, and we will find somebody to go to a form of war with that involves the physical fighting.
Perhaps. I think that, when it comes to ways, to wage war against people, I mean, obviously, you think of, guns and bullets, kinetic warfare, I guess nuclear or biological, whatever. You also have, other big weapons that people probably haven't made an association yet. I'm not saying this is the case, but just if you permit a science fiction example, suppose, let's say you had the ability to, if not necessarily control the weather, maybe you could say amplify the weather. So you might be able to run, you might be able to project power through that way as well. You have like the technical aspect, like countries hacking other countries and stuff like that, financial warfare. So I think there's definitely a lot of things.
Do you think you could give a history of wars and why you think that we are at that the end cycle where we would most likely see one within this decade?
Okay, right. So for the fourth turning viewpoint, if you look at it from the American viewpoint of the fourth turning, the first fourth turning we went through was circa 1776, the Revolution. The second one was the Civil War. Third one was World War II, or you could say the Great Depression / World War II. And then that takes us up to right now, number 4, which is kind of where we're at, the fourth turning for that. I think that right now for America, for us to get through this, sooner or later, we are going to have to answer the question, and this gets back into the realm of philosophy, but is there such thing as objective truth, or is everything subjective? The current popular narrative is that everything is subjective. Or back up, if you want me to put it in economic terms, the Keynesians would be people who think everything is subjective. The Austrians would be people who are much more on the side of objectivity for that. But I am cautiously optimistic as of where we're at right now in America. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. The fact that we have the Second Amendment is something that I think people need to take a lot of.
Well, I think the war could be within America. I'm not saying there's going to be a world war or a war with China, like what you're kind of suggesting. I think there's an extremely high chance that there's a civil war of a kind. The only thing that I would let the audience know is we've had 3 fourth turnings in the past. We are currently on our 4th, and so far they have only ever ended in the physical kinetic type of warfare. That does not mean it's going to happen now, but 3 for 3. Will we be 3 for 4 or 4 for 4? I would take my money and take a bet that we will see the same type of warfare in an aspect of the physical kind.
I do think there will be a physical component to the conflagration that will close out this turning. I mean, I'll be very surprised if there wasn't. But my point is that I will be even more surprised if it's on the relative level of, let's say, World War II was to the third, or the Civil War was to the second. I don't think it's going to be that big an impact. I do think there will be a physical spillover in conflict. I just don't think the physical spillover will be to the extent from the American perspective as it was in the prior ones.
I don't think they'll take the nuclear path. Man, this is just wishful thinking, because if that was the case, then Albert Einstein would be correct in his statement where he said something
Well,
like,
yeah, and the thing is, like,
I don't think,
I'm not worried about that. Like, what I'm worried about is I'm worried about whatever weapons they've discovered and have developed and can deploy that the public doesn't know about and that the public won't perceive as a weapon. Again, my go-to example is like, let's say that you can modify the weather. I mean, that might not be like dropping a nuclear bomb on someone, but still the amount of destruction you could, like, wreak or whatever, the amount of destruction you could inflict upon a foreign party because of this due to the weather, that's pretty powerful. And if the public's not perceiving it as a weapon, it's just, bad luck or whatever. That's scary, man. In a strange way, like nuclear weapons, if people see a mushroom cloud going off, they kind of know what happened. But if people just see, a repeated string of, bad weather, horrible hurricanes, sudden earthquakes that keep hitting over and over and over again, people just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, God's mad.
yeah, I definitely don't think that they can control the weather, but I know what you mean. If there is something that
just for example,
as warfare, but as some just bad luck, just hitting them over and over again.
You started off by saying, the fourth turning, total war, and do we think that we're going to have one for this one to close out? My response is, well, I think we're already in a state of war. That's the bad news. But perhaps maybe some of the good news is that for this particular war, I think it's very much more in the mind than in the world of reality. Now, pluses and minuses on that front, you don't have building, at least not yet, buildings getting blown up or whatever. So that's good. But still, when things are in the mind, it doesn't mean it's any easier or it's any less painful when you have to deal with these things or any harder to navigate. So there's that.
I just think we're a few years away from the turning point where people have hit their peak divide and where they will get angry and push off their aggression towards each other. There was a study done with rats in a cage where when there was one rat, they would have a device that shocked the rat every few minutes. And when there's just one rat, the rat would just sit there, curl up in a ball and accept the shock every few minutes. But when you put two rats in the cage and that rat is getting shocked, those rats then aggression, they're saying, well, this guy must be shocking me over here. So they fight to the death until there's only one rat left. And when they don't know, it was the guy in the coat behind the box.
Yeah, so to take that to the next step, what that suggests to me is that if the rats could ever get themselves put together to say, wait a minute, we see it's this, bad scientist over here who's really the cause of all our ills and not blame the other, then that would be a very interesting experiment. And so I would say in our particular situation, if people could, or we'll back up, once, a problem happens, my guess is that probably the big catalyst that's going to wake people up will be a financial catalyst. That's I think what you're going to see is really kick things off into high gear. But let's look ahead on worrying. Then the question will become: people will be upset. They'll be, they will have lost their retirement. They've lost their portfolios. They would have lost their dreams. They're not going to be very happy. They will cry out and look for someone to blame. And that's when you have people who can be most vulnerable to whatever the most seductive answer is versus the most logical answer. So, yeah. But good news is that if you can get that answer right, everyone, if you can identify the correct villain, everyone will be on board with making a response against that villain. If you can find the correct villain.
I just don't think the correct villain has ever really been found, but we will see how this plays out in the future's years to come. I am Justin's probably optimistically pessimistic on the shorter.
Yeah, which is very strange.
Yeah,
which is very odd as a juxtaposition for me.